to the Forever Family Ministry for asking me to come this morning. This is really my passion. I love working with foster families and adopted families and the people that support them, as well as young people. Just to tell you just a quick little bit about who I am. I started out as a middle school math teacher and ended up going into foster care and adoption, working with a foster care agency in Denver, and also about that same time decided to become a foster adopt parent to Boulder County, and had a 5-year-old little boy placed with us for about 6 months, and then he was adopted by his grandparents, and he's now our godson. And after that, we switched over to international adoption, and we adopted 2 teenagers. I have a son and a daughter that we adopted at age 14 from Ethiopia. They are now 20. My daughter lives with me and goes to Community College of Denver, and my son is struggling and working on trying to figure out who he is and what they're going to do with his life. So I have been involved with both foster care and adoption on a personal level, and I love teenagers. As you can tell from working in middle school and adopting teenagers, so they're kind of my passion. So a lot of when I talk about stuff today, a lot of that will kind of be directed toward those middle school and teenagers. And I apologize if you have young kids and I don't direct it that way. If you have specific questions, I can try to answer those. But that is definitely not my specialty, and not as much my passion. But I have worked with younger kids as well. So that's who I am. I currently work for the state of Colorado as the foster care and adoption recruitment and retention specialist. And what that means is that I go out to counties all across the state and help county workers find ways of recruiting new foster parents and adoptive parents and retaining them as well. How do we support them so that we can keep them doing this amazing work that's really difficult, because it's really hard to keep people wanting to do this for a long period of time. So that's what my job is now. However, today, my little disclosure, my little thing here is that I am here as an adoptive parent, not as a representative from the state of Colorado. So anything that I say is from me and not necessarily the state. Just to make that clear, because they're kind of picky about that. They don't want that showing up on 9 News. So anyway, so I hope you all had a chance to read this quote from Julie Alvarado. She is a personal life coach, as well as an adoptive parent, a former foster parent, and she actually lives in Golden, Colorado, and has an office in Arvada. And a lot of people aren't aware that we have this really amazing person right here in our state that travels nationally to present about our kids. I work with her on a personal level, so I use a lot of her work in my trainings. But there are a lot of other people like Julie out there, so I'll mention those people as well. But I think this kind of goes to the heart of what I'm going to talk about today, about learning how we kind of keep inside to work with our kids, because sometimes they trigger us, and we have to learn how to have peace here before we can give that back to them. So you don't have the clicker today, so I have to have him do this little head nod thing. By the way, I listened to Mumford Sons on the way up from Denver, so I'm a little wired and ready to go. I know you guys hopefully had coffee and are ready too. While we're waiting on the PowerPoint, on your tables are a couple of different things. The pens and the note cards are for you to hopefully use throughout the training. I encourage you to grab a few and use those to write little quotes down or little things that I will probably repeat multiple times throughout the day. I use these all the time. It's kind of been my lifeline. I use them to take with me if I need something that is my little mantra. I also have a bulletin board in my home office, my work office, and next to my bed that have some of these quotes on there, because it's what's helped me stay sane when I'm struggling to deal with some of my kids' issues. So I hope that you'll be able to use those today as well. So feel free to write down any quotes on there. And then the oranges, I asked to put the oranges on the table because oranges are a citrus fruit, and citrus smells are very calming for our kids. So it's something that you might consider having around your house, having in different rooms of the house even, that they can smell or have those scents around. So it is a common smell. In fact, somebody was peeling one, I think, here at the table, and I walked by. That is really common. So something just to note. All right, so we're gonna just, that's all right, PowerPoint technology. The next slide is just like an intro slide. And then what I want to do for introductions, normally I really like to go around and ask who everyone is, because I really like to know my audience when I'm speaking. But because we have so many people, we're going to do it a little bit differently. And what I'd like for each of you to do, just a few questions. First of all, how many of you are adoptive parents in here? How many of those adoptive parents are from foster care? Most of you. Any international adoptive parents in the room? Okay. How about anybody adopting older teens, like teens and stuff? All right. And how many of you are foster parents? Oh, yay! I mean, I love you adoptive parents too, don't get me wrong. I love foster parents because that's how I give them back. All right, so we have lots of foster parents. How many of you are family members of foster or adoptive parents? Yay, we love those support people. All right, awesome. And how many of you are professionals, either social workers, child care workers, that kind of thing? Okay. How many of you have heard of the term trauma-informed care or trauma-informed parenting? That's also really good.
Is that too dark, Christy? It just helps.
Yeah, that's good.
It was just kind of light.
Yeah,
So.
that's good for you guys up here, and that's fine with me. Okay, how many of you have attended a workshop ever by Dr. Bruce Perry, Julie Alvarado, Heather Forbes, or Brian Post? So some of you are familiar with their work. Okay, good. Okay, so that kind of gives me a good starting point. And I had a feeling, I was pretty sure that we have a really diverse audience as far as where you guys are and what you've heard before. So what my plan is today is to really start kind of from the beginning, talking about who our kids are, and bring, we can go to the next one. Actually, the next one. So we're going to talk about who our kids actually are. Where do they come from? What are some of their issues? We're going to talk about the brain, because that's key, and especially for me, this was like a really important thing to learn. When I first started looking into becoming a foster and adoptive parent, I attended a love and logic class before I ever had kids. I don't have any biological kids, by the way. So I attended a love and logic class, thought it was like fantastic, the best thing ever. I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to use this. This is great. And what I loved about it too was that it helped me take the anger out of things and taking it personally. But really, that was just the first step. That was only the first step. And what I found was that love and logic really doesn't work with most of our kids. But it was a good first step. So if any of you have taken love and logic training, great first step. But remember, there's a lot more to it. The next thing that happened for me was learning about the brain and learning from specifically Dr. Bruce Perry, who's with the Child Trauma Academy down in Texas. If you haven't heard of him or read any of his books or looked online, he's amazing. He's doing some great work, and he really has started getting us scientific information about the brain and what happens to our kids who experience trauma, what happens to their brains, and how that actually affects their behaviors and how they relate to us and to other people. So I think it's critical, and for me, kind of being a little bit kind of science geeky, and that was really important, and I think especially for a lot of guys, that might also be good because it's science related. So we're going to talk briefly about the brain. I'm not going to get into it a whole bunch, but I want to give you that background information. Then we'll talk about trauma and how it affects that beautiful brain that we have. And then we're going to talk about co-dysregulation as well as co-regulation, what that term is kind of a buzzword right now, what that means and how we use that with our kids to help stay regulated. And we'll talk about some tools for not just parents, but also some of you who work with our kids, but maybe don't have our kids in your home every day. And then at the end, if there's questions, we'll talk about, if you have any questions around it, we'll talk about that as well. Are there any specific things, before we get into the heart of this, that any of you came today to find out? Is there anything specific that you're hoping to get out of this training today? Raise your hand if there's something you definitely want me to touch on or you have questions about. Everybody's just open. It's awesome. Okay, so at some point during the training, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, shout it out, whatever. I don't see you. Happy to do that throughout the training. Okay, so our kids, it sounds like most of the kids that you guys are working with are kids from our foster care system. The kids from our foster care system come with all of these things. The very first, most important thing is that grief and loss piece. And in fact, before we do this, I have one more quick little thing. I almost forgot to do this. This is the best part of the whole training. So before we really start, I want all of you to please stand up. And don't take anything with you. Leave all your stuff and move to a different table. Don't worry, your stuff will still be there. Leave your purses, leave your coats. Sit with somebody different. You don't sit with the same people. Sit with somebody you don't know. I know you. Sit really close together.
We're supposed to sit down and get food.
Because we don't know. You don't know. Give them a big hug. Okay, so I'm guessing a lot of you probably know each other in here, but I want you to tell me what it felt like when I first asked you to stand up and leave your place and move to a different table. Did anybody have a little anxiety about that? A little unsettling. Yeah, a little unsettling. Your purse, your lip stuff, your phone, your cell phone. Oh my gosh. How about having to go sit by somebody? Did any of you actually sit by somebody you didn't know? And how was that? Not too big of a deal because we're adults. But how about giving somebody a hug that you don't know? Let's say these people just came off the street and they were from all over the country. Would that feel a little more difficult? Okay. So this is just a tiny little taste of what our kids go through. Okay. A lot of times our kids are taken from their home in the middle of the night or taken from school and never get to go home to get their things. Some of them don't ever get to take their favorite stuffed animal or their favorite blanket or whatever it might be, that favorite pair of Nike tennis shoes, when if I don't have Nike tennis shoes. But whatever it is that they have, they don't get to take those things with them. They're not told why they're moving. They're not told who they're going to go see. They go into this new place where there are new smells, new people, new things, a whole different way of life. And so it's a really traumatic event for them. And some of them have to do that over and over and over again. So the point of that little exercise was really just to get you to try to put yourself in their shoes a little bit to see what that might be like and understand how traumatic that is. And if you think back to when you were a kid, I know for me, every time I went to state, I really struggled to go do the little overnight things with my friends because it smelled different. And smell is a big, big thing for me. So when I'd walk into somebody else's house and I would smell their mom cooking fried food, or I would smell their mom who did laundry a different way, used a different soap, it was very unsettling and scary for me. And so I struggled with that. And that was just an overnight. So again, just think about that when you think about our kids and how difficult that is for them. So now that you're in a different spot, you can either stay there or if you'd like to go back to your things. Okay, so to get kind of back on track, so the loss day, that's what we're talking about with grief and loss. Sometimes it's not a parent that dies. Sometimes, it's not that type of grief that we normally think about, but it's the loss of everything that they know. It's what they're comfortable with. So that's probably the biggest one that I think is important. I think that one trumps the abuse and neglect that we hear about. And it sounds kind of crazy, but it really does. That's just huge for them. Obviously, we know that a lot of our kids have been abused in some way, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse or verbal abuse, and that does affect them as well, but that grief and loss piece is huge. The neglect, I think, is also not looked at as big of a deal as what it is. I can tell you that during my time of actually working with kids in care, when I would read case files, that I would see neglect that I didn't even know existed. Neglect where kids are left in their rooms, locked in their rooms, don't get to use a toilet, where there's feces and urine all over their bedrooms, where they're not given food, they're not held, they're neglected severely. They're not beaten, they're not raped, and they're not tortured, but they're left to just fend for themselves. And what we know about the brain is that when our kids don't get that touch and that physical affection and their basic needs met, that their brains don't develop properly. And so neglect is a huge, huge piece for our kids. Fear and anxiety, that comes usually with all of this other stuff as a result of some of these other things. So when their needs aren't met, when they don't get food, they're afraid. Our kids that are hoarders, I don't know if you have any hoarders, or kids that have trouble with food and wanting to eat all the time, or keeping things in their bedrooms, or stealing food, that comes from not having enough food when they were little. Anxiety, even up here talking, I get a little anxiety, and our kids get that all the time. Their heart starts racing because they're nervous. They may start shaking, sweating. They might start acting out with behaviors. So that anxiety piece is there. Cultural differences. A lot of times people think that we're talking about just differences with international adoption, and that's not true. Even within your own community, there are cultural differences, huge cultural differences. And it's not just about race. It's not about a Caucasian family taking in a Hispanic child or an African American child. There are Caucasian families that have very different lifestyles than this other Caucasian family. They have cultural differences. And when you lose that, you have another piece of grief and loss added to your plate. So it's something really important to remember when you get a new kid in your home or you're working with a kid, that their culture may be very different from your own, even if they look like you. Poverty, huge. Kids that come from poverty don't have enough money. A lot of their basic needs aren't met, and most of our kids are coming from poverty. Discrimination, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be about the color of your skin. Oftentimes it is, but it can be just because you maybe wear different clothes, you don't have enough money to buy new shoes, and your toes are poking out of the end of your shoes. And you can be discriminated against by other kids at school. That happens to little kids all the time. Multiple placements, we talked about that, how we not only our kids get moved once, but often multiple times. I worked with a young girl, she was about 11, I believe, at the time that I started working with her. She had been in care for 6 years, so I think since she was around 4 or 5, she'd been in care. And she had had 67 placements. 67 times she got to get up and leave her house, and sometimes probably not take anything with her, and go live with new people. So again, when you are working with our kids, especially those of you who are our support system or our child care workers, it's really important to know that just that kid coming into your house is really scary, because that's like leaving their house. If they started getting settled in their home, when mom or dad bring them over to daycare or drop them off in the church daycare or grandma and grandpa's house, that can be incredibly scary for them. New smells, don't know if mom and dad are coming back. That can trigger behaviors. So really important to know that when they come into your home, that you really are nurturing and accepting and receiving them in a really loving, caring way, and that can help calm some of that just coming to daycare or childcare. Difficult trusting adults, obviously. Not only do they have trouble trusting their parent figures, but anybody else, any other adult authority figure. I worked on a project recently where we were trying to work with youth to do a PSA. And these were former foster care youth who were now young adults. And I wanted to talk to them and told them about this project and how we really wanted to hear their voice. And that was what was really important, was to hear the youth voice. Well, a few weeks later, I got word that we weren't going to do this project. And I had to go back and tell those kids that we weren't going to do that. And it was devastating to me because I knew they already had trouble trusting adults, trusting the system, trusting parents, trusting anyone in their lives. So anytime that we are telling kids something, we need to make sure that we don't make these open-ended promises, that we have to be really careful with our words because our kids already struggle with that trust piece. So just be really aware of that when you're talking to your kids. Fragmentation of services, that's a really social worky kind of way to say it. What that just means is that our kids often have services that are disrupted. For example, their therapist may change. If they're going from one home to another, they're in different counties, their therapists are often going to change. Schools are going to change. Our kids suffer from educational neglect, meaning that they have all these different, they've been in all these different schools, and so they've missed out. So again, that's usually due to multiple moves and being in different placements. All right, on to the beautiful brain. So this is a little the geeky part, but really important if you haven't heard this stuff before. Really important stuff. So I'm going to try to break it down, and I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist or neurology expert, but I can tell you a little bit about the brain, the basic stuff that's important to know. So the brainstem is the part that comes hardwired already. It's the part that we don't really have to train, that we're born with, that it helps us keep our heart rate regulated, our temperature, our blood pressure, all of that stuff is stuff we don't have to have our brain say, okay, heart, beat, or okay, lungs, breathe. That stuff already happens, so that's in our brainstem. Then we have what's called the midbrain or the limbic brain. And this part is referred to a lot in when we talk about trauma-informed care. And the limbic system is where we have emotion and attachment and regulation, where we're able to develop all of those things. And in that part of the brain, we have some different pieces that get referred to a lot when we talk about trauma-informed care. We have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And those are all big words, and I just throw them out there so that you kind of get used to hearing them because they're really important parts of our brain, so I'm going to explain a little bit more. And then we have the cortex, and the cortex is where we have abstract reasoning, logic, where we process things. It's the part of our brain that doesn't get developed until a little later on, and it sometimes doesn't work for our kids. And the reason that happens, so what happens with our kids is when they're little, if they are not held and touched, and if they aren't given all of that nurture that most of us were given, then their brain doesn't develop the same. What happens is they go into this state of fear and anxiety because they're not getting their basic needs met. And then that information is stored in their brain. It's there forever, forever, ever, ever. And it is very difficult to change, although there is hope, and we found out now that we can change all of those, not necessarily change the memories, but how we react. So what happens is our kids have that stored in their brain, and then when they get older, little tiny things that maybe would be normal for us can trigger them. And it sends them to that part of the brain, that part where they have the emotion and attachment and all of that. It sends that to their brain, and their brain goes, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get what I need, and they start having those behaviors that we've probably seen, whether it's tantruming, or screaming, or being defiant, or lying, or stealing, or aggression. All of those things come out of fear that some need is not going to be met. And that's a really different way of thinking. A lot of us think, we were raised, if you're raised like me, to think that our kids do these things just to get at us. They're pushing our buttons. It's like, oh my gosh, that kid knows exactly what my buttons are, and he is just pushing my buttons today. Well, that's not true. But yeah, they might be pushing your buttons, but that's your own stuff. That's the stuff that you have to work on. That's not their stuff. Their stuff is that somehow their needs are not getting met. Something is not getting met. They're afraid that you're not going to take care of them. They're not going to get food. They're going to get punished, whatever it might be. And they go into that part of their brain and they react out of fear. So we can always stop and think about that when we think about our kids' behaviors. Then that will help us to be better parents. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about early childhood trauma, it actually affects the brain. There are, if you want to Google, if you go online, I was going to bring the, there's a video and a couple of slides, but you can go on online and put in trauma in the brain and Bruce Perry, and there will be some pictures. He's actually done scans, CAT scans, of kids' brains. And so they show the brain, they show a healthy brain, and then they show a brain of a 5-year-old who has suffered abuse and neglect. And there are actually holes in that child's brain. There was nothing physically done to that child. He doesn't have a disease, nothing like that. It's just that neglect piece, not getting what that child needed, affected his brain. And so we know, without a doubt, that that happens. So their actual brains change when they're not getting what they need and they have trauma. And then it can get hardwired, and that's what I was talking, where those memories are stored in your brain. It's hardwired. You go into that place and react out of fear because it's stored in your brain. Some of those behaviors are very difficult, and it's actually not just remembering, but they're actually re-experiencing it. So sometimes our kids will actually go into those memories. For example, my son, I think, does this, and he doesn't talk about stuff a lot yet. He's still struggling with talking about his past. But I think what happens with him, I see it sometimes, is when he's afraid, he gets incredibly defiant, and he's started being aggressive as well. And I actually see it in his face. And if you start getting really in tune with your kids, you're going to see this blank kind of look come over their face. And that's when they're going into that place where they're actually re-experiencing that trauma. Not just remembering it, but where they're actually feeling it in their body. So most likely, if you took their pulse or their heart rate, it's going to be skyrocketing at that time. If you look at them, they might be shaking, they might be moving a lot. Some of our kids do the opposite and just kind of go numb and do nothing. But you'll see it in their face, and so I really, really recommend that you start watching your kids when they start acting out. Instead of acting out yourself, which we're going to talk a little bit about that, start to look at what's happening with them and see what is going on with their bodies, with their eyes, and are they going into that place of trauma and re-experiencing it. And then, of course, what I said before, we now know that our brains can actually change, and there is hope. The studies now are showing, especially Dr. Bruce Perry's work, is showing that when we start using trauma-informed care practices, that our kids' brains start to change and they start to develop, and some of that black area starts to go away. They do a thing called brain mapping now, where they're looking at different parts of the brain and what's working and what's not working at the beginning when we first start this treatment and working on this. And then they take another CAT scan of it and see what's working again later on, and they're actually seeing pieces of the brain starting to work, even in our older kids. So it's really encouraging, and I know that we hear a lot of times, well, those kids are just so traumatized and so damaged, we're never going to be able to fix them. And of course we're not going to be able to fix them, but we can help them heal, and we can get them to a much, much better place. Another quote, I have a lot of quotes through this thing. So, children must have parents able to accept the impact of their own history in order to assist the child in accepting his or her history. And I think this is really key in talking about our kids. If in a good place ourselves, then we can't help our kids. And that goes for everybody, whether you're the parent of the child or a worker, you have to be in a good place. So let's say you're going into work that day and you have really struggled at home, you've had a bad day, but you're going into your daycare provider. If you don't get yourself regulated and in a good spot, you will struggle working with your kids that day. No matter how great they are. You're going to be triggered and you're not going to be able to help them the way that you need to. So I think it's really important. This is still a work in process for me, by the way, to get to that good place. There are days when I can and days when I can't. And I think that every day we have to wake up and think about that piece for ourselves, about what we need to do. And what really started working for me was when I went, actually I talked to you about working with Julie. I went to a retreat that she did, a women's retreat, and it was a 3-day retreat. I really didn't have the money to spend on it, but I was struggling. At that time, I was in the middle of getting divorced. Part of that was because of what was going on with our kids, definitely not blaming our kids because it wasn't their fault, but we were dealing with a lot of tough stuff with our kids. My son, was going through a lot of struggles in school, was being aggressive, defiant, lying, using drugs, and it was a really rough time. And he decided he was going to leave his senior year of high school. He moved out of our home, and I knew that if that happened, that my daughter would go with him because they have a trauma bond. And anytime something is going on with one of them, the other one steps in to take care of that one. And she was actually doing fantastic. She worked on a lot of her stuff when she came home. She was doing great, but she left with him. And so my kids had moved out of the house their senior year, and we were also trying to get my son to figure out if he had a mental illness and trying to get help from him. He was refusing help. And I went to a 3-day retreat with Julie, and it was just so empowering because I realized that what was going on partly was my reaction to them, that I would react to my kids' issues instead of being the nurturing, loving mom while they're struggling with their stuff. I was letting my stuff get in the way of that. And so I would ask you all when you leave here to think about that. What is your stuff? What's inside that you need to work on? Because if you don't work on that, you can't help your kids. It's really simple, and it takes a long time to figure that out sometimes, and a lot of work. But so ask yourself that when you leave, what do you need to do? We're going to talk more about that co-dysregulation thing in a minute. Oh, and there it is. Next slide. All right, so I think I mentioned to you that, well, I've obviously talked about Bruce Perry, but I went to one of his trainings, and I struggled with this co-regulation, co-dysregulation thing. I didn't quite get it. And and my chart is not nearly as cool as his was, but this really, really helped me to understand what that means. And so the way he explained it, he talked about, if we think about a mom, a young mom, and an infant, okay? When that mom is holding that infant and rocking and soothing and cooing to that child, and that child is so happy, both of them are regulated. They're in what I call the green zone. When they're calm, they're happy, everything is just awesome. Okay, so you got the green zone, that's regulation, that's total regulation. Well, then mom takes the infant, the baby, into the baby's room and puts it in the crib. The baby's sleeping and she's happy and everything's great. Mom's off in the other room doing dishes. And let's say 30 minutes later, she starts to hear the baby making some noise on the baby monitor. And so she's aware of it, but she's not, everything seems fine. Then baby starts kind of crying and is getting a little bit upset. So mom maybe thinks, maybe I should go into the room. Well, I'll give her a minute and see if she calms herself. And so baby now is starting to go into what I call the yellow zone. Because baby's starting to be a little bit dysregulated. She's making noise, not totally upset, but just like, hey, not quite happy here. And then baby starts getting louder. Mom's like, all right, I need to go check on the baby. So she walks into the bedroom. So baby sees mom, and baby kind of maybe calms slightly, because when our kids see us, that visual can be a calming thing because of your presence. They know you, they recognize you. So that can help calm you. Mom's kind of maybe in that green zone still, but maybe a little bit in the yellow. And baby's not feeling well, so although she was slightly calm, it's still not feeling well. So she is getting louder, making more noises. She starts crying, so mom now goes to pick baby up. Mom picks baby up. Again, baby maybe comes down just a little bit because now she's being held. And she can smell the mom, she feels her touch. So she is being calmed down a little bit. But baby now has gotten a fever in this time or whatever, she's sick. So she's not feeling that great. So she's still not completely calm. And so she starts escalating. And this goes on, and mom's trying to rock baby, baby's still crying, baby's still upset, mom is still trying to rock, soothe, okay, we're gonna get up and do the whatever dance that baby loves, and baby's still not calming down. What often happens to mom at that point? She starts getting stressed out, right? She's like, oh, come on baby, I gotta go do the dishes, I gotta cook dinner, I gotta do laundry, do whatever. So mom is now stressed out a little more. So what happens to her body? What?
Tenses up.
She tenses up, right? So her body tenses up. What else happens probably? Her heart rate might go up a little bit, okay? And babies can definitely feel that, okay? So she's tense, she's stressed. So baby feels all of that. What then happens to baby? Baby escalates into red zone. Baby is like screaming. Nothing is making baby feel good. And mom now is even more stressed. And let's say you're that mom, you're one of those moms that has no money, that's probably going to get kicked out of her apartment. So let's think of our birth kids. Getting kicked out of the apartment. She's dealt with it. She hasn't had any sleep because baby was sick all night, and she was up with baby. And mom cannot stand this. So mom is now like, maybe not shaking the baby, but getting very angry. So what happens is they both go into red zone. It's co-dysregulation. And that happens not just with babies, but with our kids, with our older kids. For example, my son, when he pushes my buttons, what used to happen was I would co-dysregulate right along with him. He would tell me, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do that. I'm 18. I can do whatever the hell I want. And that's exactly what he was. It was worse than that. And you can't tell me what to do. And it's like, oh, yes, I can. I'm your mom. You're going to listen to me. Well, that doesn't work. Because what am I now doing? I'm at his level, right? I have now co-dysregulated. And so what we have to learn how to do is how do we stay in the green zone, or maybe it can be a little bit in the yellow zone because we're worried. But how do we keep ourselves in that zone so that we can then help our kids go from red zone back down to yellow and back into green? How can we help calm them? And the only way we can do that is for ourselves to be able to be in that green zone, be in that regulated zone. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit about how we do that, some coping mechanisms, and what you need to be able to stay in that green zone. So, this is a Julie Alvarado thing as well. So I kind of stole this from her. And this is actually in, so back there on the back table, I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's a whole bunch of books that I brought. I have my own little library on foster care and adoption and all kinds of stuff, parenting. So if you didn't get a chance to look at those books, feel free to later this morning. But there's a little pamphlet back there. It's a really small little pamphlet that Julie developed that you can get online from her. It does cost money, and I can't make copies of it, so I apologize because she has to pay her bills too. So she's developed this, but I did ask her if I could use this. And this is something that I think is really easy to remember because we know stop, drop, and roll from fire, right? Fire department. So it's what you do when there's a fire. Well, same thing here. When our kids are dysregulated, that is a fire. And we need to help put that fire out. So although it's kind of corny, it's helped me to remember some things when I'm in that kind of yellow zone and need to take it down a notch. So the very first thing when you see one of your kids, whether it's at home or in your daycare or childcare facility, is to stop. When they are starting to act out and they're pushing your buttons and you're feeling dysregulated, the very first thing that you have to do is just stop. Don't react. Don't say anything. Don't take any action. Because as long as you are dysregulated, you cannot help that child. If you're in that, oh no you didn't, or get your tail over here and whatever, that is not good, okay? Stop what you're doing, okay? Second thing, drop. And this one it was always kind of weird and I had to think about this, but it works. So drop into a different zone. And what that means is, sometimes it physically means to drop. When you're working with little guys, you need to get down on their level. When you're standing up here, what happens? I'm standing over this kid that's like, well, Johnny, I told you not to eat those snacks in the bathroom. You know, whatever it is. Then this, now I'm not touching the empty chair. Okay. So when you're talking to that little kid, you have to get down on their level. Actually get down to their level, because it takes that fear piece and that authoritarian piece out of the picture. Okay? So getting down, drop your voice. If you're talking loud, if you're talking fast, I know when I get angry, I talk really fast. I get that from my mom. So slow down, drop your voice, drop the tone, drop the loudness as well. The volume, not loudness, I want to say the volume. And one of the things that you have to do to be able to do that, usually, at least for me and for most anyone, is to sometimes step back and take some deep breaths. And although I don't have this up here, that is key to all of this. I used to hear people say that. I thought it was the craziest thing ever. And I'm like, really? Just deep breathing is going to help me be a better person? Yes, it will. So if that means that you actually need to physically remove yourself from the room, if you can't do 1 and 2 while you're in the room with that child, then you need to walk away. So unless the house is going to burn down, unless you're threatening to burn your house down, beat somebody up, do some harm to the dog, most likely whatever is happening with them doesn't have to be dealt with immediately. If they're doing something, if they're coloring on somebody else's paper, yeah, you can remove that, but rather than reacting, if you need to step away, then step away from that child. For example, my son actually did this. As an 18-year-old, started using magic marker on our vanity in our bathroom at 18. And that seems a little crazy. And really dysregulated mom comes out during that situation. So of course, yes, I'm going to take the marker, but I was so dysregulated when that happened, I knew I could not stand there and talk to my kid, because what would you most likely want to do if you see your 18-year-old using magic marker on your bathroom counter? Scream. Okay? Scream. Why are you doing this? What are you thinking? Well, they're not thinking, clearly. They are not in a place where they can think. Whatever was going on with him at that time was not a part of, he couldn't use the cortex. He could not process at that time. So me asking him, why are you doing this? What are you doing? Doesn't work. And me screaming and being angry just would create more of that. So I physically had to walk away, take some deep breaths, and come back to that later. Okay, so it's really important that anytime you're feeling dysregulated, that you learn to do that. I think one of the things, I don't know how many of you have really ever done any kind of work, like body work or awareness work of your own body, but that's another thing I would encourage you to do going forward. When you feel dysregulated, like when let's say you're at work, it's not even about your kids. So let's say you're at work and your boss tells you that to turn in something by 5 o'clock today, and it's a project that's going to take you like 2 hours, and it's now 4:30, and you now have to stay later and you're angry or whatever. I would encourage you to take a step back from that situation and think about how your body's feeling. It's taken me a long time to recognize, but I know now I can actually feel my heart rate and my blood pressure go up, and I can feel my shoulders getting very tense. I hold a lot of my stress in my neck and also in my hips. And so when my hips start hurting, I know that I've probably been pretty stressed out. And it takes a lot of work to have that kind of awareness, but that's what you're going to need to work with our kids. So when you feel that your body becoming tense, you need to step back. Okay, walk away, give yourself some time, whether it's taking a walk around the block, deep breaths, have coffee or tea, whatever it is that helps you calm. I would encourage you to do that. So once you get past the drop and you're now in this good place again, then you roll back into relationship. So it's all about relationship. Our kids can't do anything without relationship. We have to learn how to improve that relationship. So you're going to roll back into relationship. You're going to roll into letting the child know how you feel. So an example of this, I'm so proud of myself this week. Like I said, I'm still working on this. But this last week, my daughter, she's doing actually really great. So it's easy to work on some of my stuff with her because even when she makes me mad, she's in such a great spot, and I recognize that it's easy for me to be a good parent to her right now. But she did something that was kind of frustrating this past week, and she texted me. She does a lot of texting, so you have to learn how to do this over text too, which sometimes can be difficult. Much better to do in person, but when they're 20, texting sometimes is what you get. So she was texting me that she couldn't do something that I had asked her to do, and I had texted her back, and I took a deep breath. I didn't text her back right away because I was actually kind of angry and frustrated, and so I stepped back, sat there for a little while, took a couple breaths, and I texted her back, and I'm like, I need to let her know how I feel. Doesn't mean I have to be angry at her, but I need to let her know that what she just did was hurtful and disappointing to me. And so that's what I did. I texted her. I said, well, I can't lie to you. I'm hurt and disappointed. And she texted me back, I know, Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. And I said, I know you are. Thank you for telling me you're sorry. So instead of being angry, which is what we think we are, it really wasn't anger. It was, I was hurt and I was disappointed. And so I think when we're in that good space, when we've taken deep breaths, we can then go to our kids and use the right words about how we're feeling. So it is important to tell them how you feel so that they hear that, especially our older kids. Sometimes our little kids don't quite get that as much, but our older kids, we can do that. But in this loving, caring way, without anger and without consequences. Okay, so our kids have had so many consequences that that's all they're thinking about, what's going to happen to me. And they're afraid that you're going to give them another consequence. So we have to step back from that, tell them how you feel, and go back into a relationship. And so even when my son used magic marker at 18 on my bathroom counter, I didn't get angry with him. I did initially, walked away, and just said, Bonnie, I'm really disappointed. Like, what are we going to do about this? And it catches them off guard. I think you would be so surprised at how they react. They're like, Mom didn't just scream at me, and she's like, wow. And it's amazing to see your kids and they calm down from their dysregulation when you can do that. So they then are much calmer and you can work on it. And the reality is really, my bathroom countertop had to be replaced, but it cost me some money. Is it the end of the world? No, my life goes on. Okay, and I think that's the way we have to look at it. So roll into letting them know how you feel, and then the other piece, and this is the harder part, is exploring how they feel. Because we can't do it in the way that we can't do what were you thinking, why did you do this? Because that's not really what it's about. It's about how were they feeling. And so that takes a little more work. It's like, so, how do you feel about this? into that exploration of what's going on with them. Why are they feeling that they need to act out? And a lot of times they're not going to be able to tell you, but it's opening that door and giving them that opportunity. For my daughter, who's in a good place and has worked on stuff, she can tell me that stuff. I can say, so what was going on in your head when, whatever happened? Or how are you feeling about that? What's going on? And she can actually talk to me. But it's taken a lot of time. So the other thing I want you to know about this takes practice. This will not happen tomorrow for those of you who don't already kind of do something like this. This is a whole new shift in how you're going to be parenting and working with our kids. And so I would encourage you to be gentle with yourselves about this. When you don't do it right, be gentle. Encourage yourself to just try again and to work on it the next time, because it will take time. And when we do this with our kids, it doesn't change their behavior overnight. The next day, they're still going to probably act out. They're still going to have those behaviors. But what happens is over time, over years, where my daughter, like I said, they've both been home 6 years, but she started working on stuff pretty early, and that has, we've been able to work together on a lot of things, and she's in this good place. But it's 6 years, and it's still a struggle. For my son, he didn't work on anything when he came home. He was happy-go-lucky. He was the best kid ever. He was so happy and so easygoing. And I remember telling my husband that this is going to be a challenge. All that grief and loss is going to come flooding back at some point, and we're going to have a challenge. And that's exactly what happened. About 2.5 years after he had been home, we started seeing that stuff come out, and he's just now starting to work on it. But he's getting better. It's working because I'm approaching it in a whole different way than I was before. So take your time.